Working title: The Farm War. The crackle of a 911 call cut through the static of the police scanner. There's an armed man on my street. The voice was shrill and panicked. He's threatening my life. Send help immediately. The dispatcher remained calm, attempting to gather information, but the woman's voice only grew louder, more frantic. A dusty gravel road came into view. A large red tractor rumbled as a man wiped sweat from his brow. Hank Dawson, a lifelong farmer, stood in his field, utterly bewildered as the distant sound of sirens grew louder. His worn flannel stuck to his back as police cruisers roared toward him, kicking up a thick cloud of dust. What in the hell? Hank had no idea what was coming. He didn't know that this would be the start of a war, one that would pit him against the most relentless force he had ever faced, not nature, not the markets, but an HOA queen named Karen Pierce. And she was about to take things too far. A few hours earlier, the sun hung low in the sky, casting golden hues over Hank's farm. His family had owned this land for 3 generations, and no amount of suburban expansion was going to change that. Not if he had anything to say about it. He was knee-deep in work, tending to his crops, when he heard the unmistakable, grating voice of Karen Pierce. "Hank," she called out, her voice sharp and impatient. He sighed, glancing up to see her standing at the property line, hands on her hips. She was dressed in perfectly pressed slacks and a pastel cardigan, the uniform of suburban supremacy. Behind her, a small group of HOA board members lingered, eager for a show. Hank leaned against his shovel. "Unless you're here to buy eggs, I ain't got time, Karen." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "This," she gestured toward his land, "is ruining our community's property values. Chickens running around, unsightly barns, those awful smells. It's unacceptable." Hank chuckled, shaking his head. "Lady, my family's been farming here long before your HOA nonsense ever existed. Your rules don't apply to me." Karen stepped forward, a smug glint in her eye. "That's where you're wrong. This area is transitioning into a more civilized community. The board and I have decided we can't allow unsightly farms so close to our homes." Hank wiped his brow and smirked. "Good luck with that." Karen's expression faltered for just a moment before she forced a smile. "I was hoping we could handle this amicably, but if not, we have other ways of ensuring compliance." Hank shook his head. "You can't enforce HOA rules on land that ain't in your jurisdiction." Karen's smile faltered, her fingers twitching at her side. But she said nothing. Instead, she turned on her heel, her group trailing behind her. Hank watched them go, shaking his head. He dealt with difficult people before. He figured she'd huff and puff, maybe send a few nasty letters, and then get bored. He couldn't have been more wrong. The next morning, Hank stepped outside and stopped dead in his tracks. His fence was plastered with HOA notices. Bold letters screamed violations: unauthorized livestock, improper land maintenance, failure to comply with beautification standards. A cease and desist letter was stuffed into his mailbox, accusing him of operating an unapproved agricultural site. Hank let out a booming laugh, shaking his head as he ripped the papers off his fence. These people must be out of their damn minds. That afternoon, as he loaded hay into the back of his truck, a convoy of black SUVs rolled up his driveway. The doors opened in unison, and out stepped Karen and a group of HOA board members, dressed as if they were about to host a garden club meeting rather than confront a farmer. A man in a stiff suit cleared his throat. "Mr. Dawson, as per the HOA's new bylaws, you are required to remove all livestock and cease agricultural activity within 30 days. Hank raised an eyebrow. "New bylaws? Ain't I not part of the HOA?" Karen stepped forward, a smug grin stretching across her face. "We've expanded the HOA jurisdiction. You're now part of our community, whether you like it or not." Hank folded his arms. "That's not how property rights work." Karen's grin faltered for just a moment before she smoothed out her expression. "We have legal counsel who says otherwise." Hank shrugged. "Well, I got common sense, which says you got no authority over me." Karen's jaw clenched. "You'll regret this, Hank. Just wait." She turned on her heel and stormed off. Hank watched her go, shaking his head. He figured she'd run out of steam soon enough. But that night, under the cover of darkness, Karen put her next plan into action. The sound of rustling woke Hank from a dead sleep. For a moment, he thought it was just the wind. But then he heard it again, the distinct crunch of footsteps on gravel. Hank sat up in bed, listening. His farm was quiet at night, save for the occasional rustling of animals in the barn. But this was different. Grabbing the flashlight from his nightstand, he crept to the window and peered outside. What he saw made his blood boil. A group of men in dark uniforms were tearing up his crops. He grabbed his shotgun, not raised, just held, and stormed outside. What in the hell do you think you're doing? The men froze, wheelbarrows full of uprooted plants and discarded soil sitting by the roadside. One of them stammered, glancing toward the road. And there she was, Karen, standing at the property line, arms crossed, a smug smirk on her face. "Just making sure the community stays beautiful," she said, voice dripping with condescension. Hank exhaled sharply, gripping his shotgun tighter. "You're trespassing." Karen waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, please. This is all within the HOA's authority." And that's when she saw the shotgun resting in Hank's hands. Her eyes widened. A sickeningly triumphant look crossed her face as she reached for her phone. "Yes, hello? An armed man is threatening my life." Hank blinked. "You have got to be kidding me." Karen took a dramatic step back, her voice growing louder. "He's waving a gun. Please, send someone before he shoots me." In the distance, sirens wailed. Hank shook his head in disbelief. This wasn't just Karen playing dictator. This was a setup. Moments later, flashing lights flooded the dark road as police cruisers skidded to a stop. Officers jumped out, hands hovering over their holstered weapons. A voice boomed over a loudspeaker. "Sir, drop the weapon." Hank slowly and carefully placed his shotgun on the ground, raising his hands. "I ain't threatening nobody." Karen, standing off to the side, clutched her chest like she was in a damn soap opera. "He pointed it at me. He was screaming, threatening to kill me." One of the officers glanced at her, then back at Hank. "Sir, is that true?" Hank scoffed. "I was standing on my own damn property, holding my gun like any farmer would." "She's lying." Then, another voice cut through the night. "I got it all on video." A small crowd of neighbors had gathered along the roadside. Mark, one of the younger homeowners, not an HOA puppet, stepped forward, phone in hand. The cop took the phone and pressed play. The video showed the truth. Hank never once raised the gun. He had barely moved before Karen started dialing 911. The officers exchanged glances. One of them sighed, rubbing his temple. "Ma'am, are you sure you want to stick to this story?" Karen's confidence wavered for a split second before she doubled down. "That video doesn't show everything. He was threatening me before the camera started rolling." The lead officer shook his head. "Ma'am, filing a false police report is a crime." Karen's face drained of color. What? "No, I was just." "You said he was threatening your life with a firearm." "That's a serious accusation. From what we see in this video, that doesn't seem to be the case." The crowd muttered in disbelief. Someone even chuckled. Hank smirked. "So, we done here?" The officer nodded. "You're free to go." Karen let out a strangled noise of frustration, but she knew she had lost this round. The police left. The crowd dispersed. But Hank knew this wasn't over. Karen didn't strike him as the type to admit defeat. If anything, this had made her even more dangerous. Hank's suspicion was confirmed the very next morning. An official letter from the county zoning office landed in his mailbox, citing an anonymous complaint that he was violating environmental regulations. He snorted, shaking his head. Guess who? A few hours later, a county inspector pulled up in a white truck. The man stepped out with a clipboard, looking apologetic. "Sorry about this, Mr. Dawson," he said, adjusting his glasses. "We got a complaint about your livestock and soil treatment methods." Hank smirked. "Let me guess. Karen." The inspector sighed. "I can't say for sure, but yeah, probably." The inspection began. And, as expected, Hank was fully compliant. His farm was clean. His livestock is healthy. His soil is within regulations. By the time the inspector left, he shook Hank's hand. "She's wasting your time and mine. If she keeps making false reports, we might have to take action against her." That should have been the end of it. But Karen? She didn't stop. Later that afternoon, the roar of heavy machinery sent Hank sprinting outside. A landscaping crew stood by his property line, trucks filled with mulch, bushes, and decorative trees. The foreman, a burly man in an orange vest, approached him with a clipboard. "We got an order to begin HOA-mandated beautification," he said, reading from the paper. Says here we're authorized to alter the landscaping to align with neighborhood aesthetics. Hank stared at him. Who authorized that? The foreman glanced at the clipboard. Karen Pierce, HOA president. Hank let out a low chuckle. This woman really doesn't quit. The foreman shifted awkwardly. So do we start or not? Hank stepped forward, arms crossed. I'd love to see you try. A beat of silence passed. Then, the foreman cleared his throat. Yeah, no, we're not doing this. He turned back to his crew. Load it up, boys. We're out of here. Hank laughed as they drove off. But he knew Karen's next move wouldn't be so easy to shut down. And he was right. That night, Hank was just about to turn in when the sound of engines growling outside stopped him cold. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped onto his porch, his gut already telling him something was wrong. At the edge of his property, a group of men in unmarked trucks were unloading animal transport cages. Hank's stomach dropped. He stormed across the yard. What the hell do you think you're doing? A tall, lean man with a clipboard smirked. We're here to remove unauthorized livestock. Hank's fists clenched. Who hired you? The man didn't even hesitate. HOA contract. Karen Pierce. Hank took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. This is private property. You're trespassing. The man's smirk didn't fade. You won't call anyone. A clicking sound froze them all in place. Hank's neighbor, Tom, retired Marine, ex-security consultant, and overall bad news for anyone looking for trouble, stepped out from the shadows, a shotgun resting comfortably in his hands. Wrong, Tom said. I already did. A flicker of uncertainty crossed the man's face. Then, just in time, the distant wail of sirens broke the silence. The men scrambled back into their trucks, peeling out before the cops even arrived. Karen, watching from her window across the street, saw everything. She knew she had lost again. But this time, she wasn't just mad. She was desperate. And that's when she made her biggest mistake yet. The next morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. Karen had called an emergency HOA meeting at the clubhouse. Hank didn't plan on going until he got a text from Mark. Dude, you need to be here. Now. Curious, Hank climbed into his truck and headed over. The room was packed. Board members, residents, even people from outside the neighborhood who had heard the chaos. Karen stood at the podium, her face twisted into her best concerned leader expression. Which is why, she said, voice shaking with manufactured emotion, we must take action against the criminal behavior threatening our community. She turned to the crowd, lowering her voice dramatically. The only solution is to sue Hank Dawson. Gasps. Murmurs. Then uproar. Some people cheered. Others booed. Greg, one of the board members, stood up, his face red. This is insane. You already called the cops on him twice, and both times you were the one breaking the law. Now you want to sue him? Karen lifted her chin. I am protecting our neighborhood, Greg. Unlike you, I'm willing to do what's necessary. Greg scoffed. No. What's necessary is removing you from power before you bankrupt us all. A huge chunk of the room erupted in agreement. Karen gritted her teeth. This wasn't going the way she planned. Then, a voice called out from the back of the room. Hey, Karen, you still gonna explain what you did with all that HOA money? The room went dead silent. Karen's expression froze. The man who spoke, Mark, stepped forward, holding up a stack of documents. Because, Mark continued, I was looking through the HOA's financial reports, and I found something real interesting. Karen's mask cracked. Mark waved the papers in the air. Turns out, someone's been moving large sums of HOA funds into a personal account. Gasps. Murmurs. Mark's eyes locked onto Karen. You want to explain that? Karen panicked. This is a smear campaign, she hissed. You're lying. Mark grinned. Cool. So, you won't mind if we audit the HOA's financials, right? I mean, if you're innocent, you got nothing to worry about. Karen's face drained of color. Greg turned back to the crowd, his voice dead serious. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in Karen Pierce's leadership. I second it, another board member said immediately. Karen realized what was happening. She was losing control. She slammed her hands on the podium. You can't do this to me. I am the HOA. Greg ignored her. All in favor of removing Karen Pierce as HOA president, raise your hand. Nearly every single hand went up. Karen stared in horror. You traitors, she shrieked. Greg turned back to her. Karen Pierce, effective immediately, you are no longer president of this HOA. The room erupted. Karen, shaking with rage, grabbed her purse and stormed out. But she wasn't done yet. That night, Hank was sitting on his porch, enjoying a well-earned beer, when he saw her. Karen, standing at the edge of his property, her face twisted with rage. In her hands, a gasoline canister. For a split second, Hank thought she had lost her damn mind. Then, she started pouring gasoline on his crops. Hank dropped his beer. Hey. Karen fumbled with a lighter. I'll burn it all. You think you can humiliate me? Take everything from me. Hank sprinted. Just as she flicked the lighter open, he tackled her. The two hit the dirt. Karen kicked and screamed, but within seconds, Tom and a few neighbors rushed over, yanking her off Hank. One of them had already called the cops. By the time the squad cars arrived, Karen was sobbing hysterically, her hands zip-tied behind her back. Deputy Miller took one look at the gasoline, the lighter, and the absolute insanity in Karen's eyes. And he shook his head. This time, you're not getting out so easy. They hauled Karen into the back of the squad car. Her face twisted with venom as she turned to Hank. I'll sue you for everything you have, she shrieked. Hank smirked. Good luck with that. The squad car doors slammed shut. Karen was gone. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood was finally free. The next morning, the entire town was buzzing with the news. Karen Pierce, once the self-proclaimed ruler of the HOA, had been hauled off in handcuffs. Hank woke up to a text from Mark. Check the local news. You're gonna love this. Sure enough, as Hank flipped on the TV, a reporter was standing in front of the HOA clubhouse, microphone in hand. Last night, former HOA President Karen Pierce was arrested on charges of attempted arson, trespassing, and criminal mischief. Witnesses say she was caught in the act of trying to set fire to a local farmer's crops in an apparent act of revenge. This shocking turn of events has left residents questioning the integrity of their HOA leadership. The screen cut to a mugshot of Karen. Messy hair. Red-faced. Pure rage. Hank chuckled, shaking his head. Guess she ain't coming back from this one. By noon, an emergency HOA board meeting had been called. Hank didn't bother showing up this time. He had work to do, but Mark promised to keep him updated. The moment the meeting ended, Mark sent him a simple text. HOA is falling apart. Call me. When Hank picked up the phone, Mark didn't even wait for a greeting. Dude, it's chaos. The board is crumbling. People are demanding audits. Turns out, Karen wasn't just a power-hungry control freak. She was also embezzling HOA funds. Hank let out a low whistle. So, she wasn't just after me. She was robbing everybody. Yup. Tens of thousands of dollars are unaccounted for. Lavish vacations, designer clothes, all paid for with HOA fees. Hank smirked. Bet the board members ain't feeling so high and mighty now. Oh, they're panicking. Half of them just resigned to avoid getting caught up in it. The HOA is done, Hank. For the first time in weeks, Hank felt a true sense of relief. No more notices. No more threats. No more Karen. With the HOA dissolved, Hank wasted no time getting back to business. He expanded his farm stand, selling fresh produce to locals, including the very same people who once supported Karen's war against him. One afternoon, Greg, the former HOA board member, showed up looking awkward. Hank leaned on the counter, smirking. Didn't think I'd see you here, Greg. Greg scratched the back of his head. Yeah, well, turns out we were wrong about you. You're not the bad guy Karen made you out to be. Hank chuckled. Took you long enough to figure that out. Greg sighed. Can I at least buy some fresh eggs? Hank grinned. You sure you can afford him? With all those HOA fees missing? Greg groaned. All right. I deserve that. They both laughed. Months later, Hank was sorting through his mail when he came across an envelope with no return address. Curious, he ripped it open and pulled out a handwritten letter. Hank, I was wrong. I see that now. I lost everything. My home, my money, my reputation. And now I sit in a cell, wondering how it all went so wrong. Maybe I deserve this. Maybe I took things too far. But I can't undo what I did. I just wanted you to know. I'm sorry. Karen. Hank stared at the letter for a long moment. Then, without a second thought, he crumpled it up and tossed it into the fire. Some people can change. But Karen? She was never one of them. Without the HOA breathing down their necks, the neighborhood thrived. People took back control of their homes. No more ridiculous fines. No more absurd rules. And Hank, he just kept farming. One evening, as he leaned back on his porch, watching the sunset, Tom sat beside him, sipping a cold beer. "Well," Tom said, tilting his drink toward Hank's land, "you won." Hank smirked. "Damn right I did." The two men sat in peace, the farm standing tall, untouched. And the reign of Karen Pierce? Nothing but a bad memory.